In November 2022, a federal judge in San Jose looked across the courtroom at a woman who had once graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes. A woman whose net worth had peaked at $5 billion. A woman who had shaken hands with presidents and sat on stages beside Henry Kissinger. Elizabeth Holmes stood in voided, and a company once valued at $9 voided. And a company once valued at $9 billion, dissolved, erased, gone. But here is what makes this story different from every other Silicon Valley failure. Theranos didn't collapse because the market shifted or the timing was wrong. It collapsed because the product never worked, not once. Not at any point in the company's 15-year existence did Theranos reliably do what Elizabeth Holmes told the world it could do. She raised over $600 million for a destroyed them. The question isn't just destroyed them. The question isn't just how she did it. It's how an entire ecosystem of billionaires, generals, and media institutions believed her for over a decade. And what that reveals about a system that is supposed to protect the rest of us. Empire building. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford at 19. By the end of 2003, she had nearly $6 million in funding for an idea she barely had the scientific training to evaluate. Her original concept, a wearable patch that tests blood and administers medication in real time, had already been quietly abandoned. The new pitch was a cartridge and reader system. Prick your finger, insert a tiny blood sample, and a compact machine runs hundreds of diagnostic tests in minutes. The vision was genuinely compelling. Traditional blood testing required full vein draws, large, commercial machines, and days of waiting. Holmes was promising to collapse that entire chain into something the size of a desktop printer, available at your local pharmacy. Her early investors weren't healthcare specialists, they were venture capitalists and family friends. The neighbor who wrote the first $1 million check had made his money in Hotmail. The few medical investors Holmes approached asked technical questions she couldn't answer. She had spent a handful of semesters in university. She didn't have the chemistry background to evaluate her own technology, but she had something else. Holmes possessed an almost frightening talent for making powerful people believe in her. She deliberately lowered her voice to a deep baritone. She modeled herself so closely on Steve Jobs that she scheduled meetings on the same day he did, used the same marketing agency, and recruited his closest friends. By 2014, when Fortune put her on its cover, Holmes had assembled a board that read like a Washington power directory. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis. These were not scientists. They were political elites whose names sent a single overwhelming signal to anyone doing due diligence. This company is legitimate. That signal was false. Fraud mechanism explained clearly. Here is the technical problem Holmes could never solve. Blood testing involves dozens of distinct chemical and optical processes. When you shrink all of these components into a single small box, they interfere with each other. Heat from one module corrupts the readings of another. Electrical signals cross, light scatters. Then there's the blood itself. A finger prick yields drops, not milliliters. To run comprehensive tests on such a small volume, Theranos had to dilute the samples. Diluted blood falls below the detection threshold of most diagnostic hardware. The readings become noise. Theranos never solved either problem. At its peak, the Edison could perform 12 out of 250 claimed tests, and even those 12 produced wildly erratic results. So what did Theranos actually do when Walgreens customers walked in? They pricked the finger, collected the sample, and then, without telling anyone, ran the tests on conventional third-party machines in a back lab. The same large machines the entire company was supposedly making obsolete. The financial deception matched. Sonny Balwani, Holmes's boyfriend and second-in-command, gave investors revenue forecasts 10 times higher than internal estimates. Theranos had operated without a chief financial officer for nearly a decade. Ever since Holmes fired the one who confronted her about the lies in 2006, no one inside could challenge the numbers. No one outside thought to ask. Red flags people did notice. The problem was what happened to them when they spoke up. In 2006, a sales team member discovered the projections were built on dishonest pilot data. The board voted to fire Holmes. She walked into that meeting and within 2 hours convinced them to reverse the decision. Then she fired everyone who had raised the alarm. Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, worked inside Theranos and saw the failures firsthand. He went to his grandfather. He explained the Edison's inaccuracy, the failing quality controls, the systematic use of third-party machines. George Schultz, a former Secretary of State, chose to believe Elizabeth Holmes over his own grandson. And then there was Ian Gibbons. He had led Theranos' chemistry team since 2005. In May 2013, he was subpoenaed for a patent trial. He would have been forced to testify under oath about the technology. 2 days before his scheduled appearance, his wife Rochelle found him in the bathroom. He had overdosed on medication. He died a week later. Holmes did not return Rochelle's phone call. She vaguely mentioned a memorial service to a few employees and never held one. The company moved on as if nothing had happened. System failure analysis. This is where the story stops being about one person and becomes about systemic failure. Employees signed confidentiality agreements at hiring and again at departure. Balwani monitored staff through CCTV. The company's lawyers threatened anyone suspected of talking. Private investigators followed former employees. The regulatory infrastructure that should have caught this was structurally weak. Theranos operated in a gray zone between FDA device regulation and CMS laboratory oversight. The inspections that eventually revealed devastating deficiencies didn't happen until after the Wall Street Journal forced the issue. The board functioned as a reputational shield rather than a governance mechanism. And Walgreens, terrified of losing a partnership to competitors, handed over $140 million based on a 2-page summary from Johns Hopkins, not an actual test of the machines. The fear of missing out overrode the obligation to verify. Collapse. On October 15, 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published the investigation that detonated the myth. Richard Fuiss, the family friend whose patent lawsuit Holmes had spent $2 million fighting, had assembled a coalition of skeptics, including Rochelle Gibbons. They fed information to Carreyrou. Former employees came forward anonymously. Holmes tried everything to kill the story. She personally asked Rupert Murdoch, who owned the journal and had invested $125 million in Theranos, to suppress the article. He refused. The FDA inspected. The Edison's failures were confirmed. The SEC investigated. Criminal charges followed. Investors sued. In January 2022, Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. Balwani was convicted on all 12. Every appeal has been denied. In January 2026, Holmes petitioned the Trump administration to commute her sentence. Her release date remains December 2031. Human cost. Nearly 1 million test results were voided. These weren't abstractions. They were dosage adjustments, diagnostic determinations, and cancer screenings made on unreliable data. Safeway spent $350 million renovating stores for machines that never arrived. Employees who raised concerns had their careers destroyed. And Ian Gibbons is dead. Psychological autopsy. It would be simple to call Elizabeth Holmes a sociopath and close the book. But that framing lets the system off the hook. Holmes escalated her lies not because she lacked intelligence, but because each lie required a larger one to sustain it. The first exaggeration demanded a fabricated pilot. The fabricated pilot demanded a fake demonstration. The fake demonstration demanded testing on real patients with machines that didn't work. At every stage, walking it back would have meant admitting that everything before it was false. This is the architecture of compounding fraud. It isn't driven purely by greed. It is driven by the terror of being exposed, the understanding that the gap between the story you've told and the truth you're living grows wider every day, and that the only way to survive is to keep building the story faster than reality can catch up. Reflective ending. Theranos didn't fail because one person was dishonest. It failed because an entire ecosystem substituted prestige for proof. Every investor who wrote a check had the resources to commission independent testing. None of them did. Every journalist who profiled Holmes could have spoken to a diagnostics engineer. Almost none did. The board could have included a single working scientist. It didn't. Today, Elizabeth Holmes sits in a federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas. The technology she promised still doesn't exist. The patients whose results were voided still carry the consequences. The lesson of Theranos is not that fraud happens. The lesson is that the systems designed to prevent it failed, not because they were overwhelmed, but because they chose comfort over skepticism. They wanted the story to be true, and that wanting was enough